protests in Iran over the death of a woman in custody.
After not covering her hair properly. Rejection of the mullah's rule over Iran.
Burning away years of oppression.
So let me take you back to September 2022.
Anti-government protesters facing up to riot police.
Now in their third month have turned violent in dozens of Iranian cities.
Rest continuing into the night.
When millions of Iranians of all genders, ethnicities, and religions seemingly stood united under a singular cause, protesting against Iran's notorious theocratic governments, and protests the scale of which had actually only been seen once before, during Iran's infamous Islamic Revolution that saw Iran's Shiite authoritarian regime completely overthrown by this man, Ayatollah Ruhollah Mossavi Khomeini, a Shia Muslim cleric and revolutionary who would completely dismantle Iran's secular monarchy and build in its stead the notorious theocracy that still reigns to this day. A theocracy that is often subject to harsh criticisms regarding free speech abuses, totalitarianism, and gender discrimination. But in September 2022, it seemed as if this regime was finally on its last legs. Its potential downfall ironically stemming from what seemed to be a feminist cause. A woman-led uprising in opposition to rampant gender-based inequalities, or as it would eventually come to be dubbed, the Women's Revolution. But fast forward almost 2 years, and while some changes have been seen, the Islamic regime nonetheless stands strong, with 2022's optimistic outlook for a newly minted, possibly liberal Iran, but a distant memory. But why? What exactly was it that made these seemingly promising protests fail to bring about regime change? Well, my name is Sean, this is Into the Ether, and today we ask, why did the Iranian protests fail?
Several protests.
Heavy-handed tactics by the government.
More than 500 killed.
Getting slaughtered by the regime.
Revolution has failed.
Part 1. Masha Amini. So, if there is any one name that is irrefutably completely intertwined with the Iranian Revolution, it is undoubtedly that of Masha Amini. Born in September 1999 to a pair of Kurdish Sunni Muslim parents, Amini, essentially since her birth, pretty much represented the polar opposite of what the Iranian regime envisioned the ideal woman to be. Not only in her ethnic and religious backgrounds, more on that later, but also in the core nature of her womanhood. So within the theocratic regime of Iran, formed on the very strict and conservative principles of Shiite Islam, women have often found themselves highly inhibited by a series of structural barriers. Not only excluded from public life and highly limited in work opportunities, but also subject to a series of strict mandates in regards to their dress, specifically as it relates to the hijab, a garment worn by Muslim women to cover their hair, often voluntarily, but in some cases, under the threat of duress from Iran's notorious morality police, an infamous wing of the Iranian regime's police force that has been granted the capacity to enforce religiously inspired legal codes upon women, even through force. But Masha Amini, who, as we already mentioned, stemmed from a very different cultural background to traditional Persian Shiite women, often defied said mandates, often with little to no consequences. But on the 13th of September 2022, Amini's dangerously independent mindset would eventually land her into a world of trouble. The day started just like any other, as Masha Amini had arrived home from her university to visit her teenage brother Ashkan, hoping to enjoy some valuable brother-sister time as they set out on what they thought would be an uneventful stroll towards the Tehran railways. And as she had grown accustomed to, Amini did put on her hijab, but whilst giving little thought or care to its official placement on the head, as per official Iranian mandates. A life-changing decision that would wind up catching the highly unwanted attention of an official within the morality police, who like a snake in the grass pounced into action, arresting Amini for improper hijab etiquette, with the arrest shocking not only Amini but also the rest of her family, who worried about how Amini, a Shiite Kurd woman, would be treated by Iran's most feared authorities. But as her frantic family members did everything they could to assure her safe return, Amini was in turn transferred to the Morality Guard's detention center. And it's here where Masha Amini and her family's worst fears were not only realized, but also viciously exceeded in the most tragic manner possible, as Amini was reportedly beaten so viciously whilst in custody that she suffered life-threatening head trauma. And yet, despite this, the police nonetheless did nothing, not until she fell into a completely unresponsive coma, after which she was finally sent to hospital. As now in the care of a hospice and in a 2-day-long deep coma, the tragic writing on the wall had all but been written. And on the 16th of September 2022, the 22-year-old Masha Amini, only 5 days shy of her birthday, at least now in the company of her loved ones, finally cast her final breath, thus bringing a much too soon end to such a precious and young life.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن برای
And for a few melancholic moments, it seemed as if Masha Amini's story would just end there. As within the authoritarian regime of Iran, with limited freedom of expression, the tragedy was already in the process of getting buried to the sands of history. But in a valley of eternal sadness, a single ray of hope can sometimes come to reflect upon the surface. This is Nilufar Hamedi, an Iranian journalist who, in the early part of her career, actually focused on sport, until a chance hospital visit would forever change not only her own career trajectory, but also Iranian political stability as a whole. As strictly by chance, Hamedi just happened to stumble upon this scene. Two grieving parents by the name of Amjad and Majgan Amini, Masha's parents. The scene moving her to the point that she decided to take out her camera and snap a picture, in turn posting it on Instagram, where the government effectively held no power to repress it. Until, seemingly by the divine stroke of faith, it instantly became clear that this tragedy would not be forgotten. As seemingly by a rage that most of us luckily cannot even fathom, Amini's death struck a chord, as a post went mega viral, in turn sparking mass protests in Iran that would eventually come to be known as the Women's Revolution. Woman, life, freedom. A nationwide rallying cry that mobilized millions of anti-government protesters to gather. So, a pretty crazy situation, which clearly explains why women were such a prominent part of the 2022 uprising. But let's just take one step back here to provide some extra context to this story. So, in Western media, Iranian women are often portrayed as nothing more than second-class citizens in Iranian society, which, whilst accurate in many ways, is still a very overly simplified version of Iran as a whole, as women in Iran are not as servile as many may be inclined to assume, as in addition to being allowed the right to vote and given access to education, it is also often the case that laws regarding dress are usually left either unenforced, or, on the rare occasions in which they are enforced, women are usually not beaten to death, but instead sent into educational centers in which they're reminded of proper dress etiquette. Which, Orwellian as that is not quite a death sentence. And due to this laxer law enforcement, women's rights discussions and, on some occasions, even gatherings are generally more common of an occurrence than many may be inclined to assume. Now, the reason I say this isn't to imply that women are exactly where they should be in Iran, but instead to highlight why Masha Amini's death was as impactful as it was. But here's the thing, right? Calling Iran's revolution a women's revolution, and only that, is, in truth, a massive oversimplification of a rather complex web of Iranian society that rose up in opposition to the Iranian regime, and one that in this video we'll go about unpacking, starting now with Part 3, a melting pot. So, two pivotal aspects of the Masha Amini story that are often ignored are her ethnic and religious backgrounds. So, the Iranian identity, as we know it today, is pretty integrally associated with two very specific ethnic and religious backgrounds: Persian and Shiite. However, Iran's true demographic realities actually presents a very different story, as the true Iran is actually a little bit of a melting pot of different ethnicities and religions. From Turkic Shia Muslims to Christian Armenians, Baluch Sunni Muslims to Kurdish Sunni Muslims. And yet, despite Iran's rich ethnic and religious plurality, the nation nonetheless operates under a very strict ethno-religious hierarchy, with Persian Shiite Muslims categorically at the top of said structure, with said group not only holding almost all official positions despite only constituting 65% of the overall population, but also with minorities formally excluded from holding a series of positions within a government built by and for Persian Shia Muslims exclusively. A pretty disturbing apartheid-like system that has led to immeasurable suffering for so many. Now, remember how we mentioned that Masha Amini was not only a woman, but also a Kurdish Sunni Muslim? Yeah, well, in light of that, I think one can therefore understand how Masha Amini's untimely death eventually came to resonate not only with Iranian women, but also with Iran's vast number of ethnic minorities that have been subject to so much discrimination for so long, with protests breaking out in several minority-populated regions, not only in reference to women's rights, but of course, ethnic and religious ones too, as minorities and women both seemingly at their boiling point due to the Islamic regime's repressive practices, seemingly both stood united under the single cause of deposing the Islamic regime. But here's a pretty uncomfortable truth headed your way. So, despite women, ethnic minorities, and religious minorities each probably holding the most justified grievances against the Iranian regime, the truth is that these groups are actually the least likely to pose an existential threat to it, specifically because of their lack of power, and as a result, leverage within the wider Iranian system. The main reason for this being not only their lack of political representation, but also their limited economic prowess stemming from their lack of access to mobility opportunities. Which in turn begs the question, was the perceived threat of the 2022 uprising just a smokescreen? Oh dear viewer, how far from the truth that truly is. And to properly understand why, let us move on to Part 4, Iran's Theocratic Democracy. So, in the Western world, where Iran is thought of in a very similar manner to countries like North Korea or Syria, many people may tend to assume the Iranian political system to be a completely totalitarian one. But this perception is, well, mistaken in many ways. Because whilst Iran certainly can't be labeled as a liberal democracy, it does nonetheless share some notable similarities to them. Similarities such as the separation of powers, presidential elections, term limits, and more. But I know what you're thinking. Okay, so this is just another pretend to give people a choice in elections and then have elections that are, well, more corrupt than the assignment file of a student that can't keep up with deadlines. But again, in Iran, this isn't quite the case, or more specifically, wasn't the case upon the Islamic Republic's inception. That structure is actually a lot less top-heavy than you'd be inclined to assume. So, at the top of Iran's power hierarchy, of course, sits the supreme leader, or Ayatollah, officially a clergyman who also happens to stand as the head of state. And this position is completely unelected, with succession seemingly determined at the discretion of the previous Ayatollah. Though considering that there's only been 2 Ayatollahs throughout history, that really is hard to say, And the powers of this position are far-ranging, as the supreme leader serves not only as the head of state, but also the army, judiciary, and state media. However, although this position's powers are wide and far-reaching, they're still nowhere near as holistic as other dictatorial positions, as the supreme leader does not serve as the head of government, as that position is reserved for the democratically elected president, who is in turn mostly responsible for economic policy, internal security, and even foreign relations, in turn serving as the head of multiple prominent institutions in place of the Ayatollah. Now, as I already mentioned, this far from implies Iran to be some liberal democratic haven, least of all due to the fact that the unelected supreme leader does bear the authority to not only remove presidents, but also to vet and approve said candidates prior to running. What it does highlight, however, is that, limited as it is, the Iranian general populace does have somewhat of a say in stateful affairs, a say which has been personified in the very different philosophies of Iranian presidents throughout the ages, from the reformist agendas of Mohammad Khatami, who advocated for enhanced freedom of expression, tolerance, and diplomacy with the West, to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a conservative president whose nationalist sentiments surpassed even those of the more religiously minded supreme leader, and who undid most of the reforms of Khatami, only for said reforms to be brought back by Hassan Rouhani. All this to say that the Iranian people, or more specifically Persian Shiite men, have grown somewhat accustomed to some sort of democratic representation. But in recent years, this process has begun to change, as Iran's supreme leader has begun to utilize his powers in a much more authoritarian manner, barring a series of candidates from running and handpicking his own presidential candidates, and in turn indirectly expanding his powers to quasi-dictatorial levels, with the vast majority of exclusions coming from the reformist and liberal end of the political spectrum, those in the mold of Rouhani, who heavily favored laxer law enforcement of conservative Islamic mandates, and thus drastically minimizing powers of notorious institutions such as the morality police, a cause so intrinsically linked to the Masha Amini story. Though interestingly, even conservative candidates that are more nationalistic rather than theological in their approach have also faced disbarments, as evident from Ahmadinejad's presidential bid rejection, eventually leading to the election of the late president Ibrahim Raisi, a close aide to the Ayatollah in an election that was marred by an all-time low voter turnout. Clearly, a protest towards the deterioration of what little remained of Iranian democratic structures. However, democratic worries were, at the time, not the only source of anxiety for the Iranian populace. Part 5. Economic Problems. So, although Iran is a very resource-rich country with a relatively high-skilled population, its economy has nonetheless been hamstrung by a massive handicap: US sanctions that have completely excluded it from the wider global economic system, with the brunt of the effects unfortunately felt primarily not by Iran's ruling class, but instead by the common man and woman. However, under the administrations of Obama in the US and the moderate Raisi in Iran, tensions between US and Iran had significantly diminished, ultimately leading to the revolutionary Iran nuclear deal that would see a termination of US and European sanctions in return for Iran's denuclearization, with the deal providing a significant economic respite for struggling Iranians, and one that unfortunately did not go down too well with the supreme leader, especially after the election of Donald Trump, who was significantly more Iran skeptic than his predecessor, thus ultimately culminating in the collapse of the deal, with any hope of its revival all but dead after the election of Raisi in 2021, with the situation prior to Amini's death worsening to such an extent that most estimates showed as much as 30 million people to be living under the poverty line. So you have women's rights groups, minorities, and even a large core of disenfranchised Shia Muslim Persian men all pretty at the current state of the Iranian political system, and as a result, an Iranian regime that's very existence was now under threat. And yet, even today, the same regime still stands strong. So how did they do it? Well, it's a long story, and this video is already pretty long, so stay tuned for part 2 for more. This has been Sean from Into the Ether. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified of part 2. Thanks for watching, and ciao!